Using manual mode on a DSLR camera isn't as scary as what it seems, but you do need a little practice to understand what you're doing. So stick around and I'll show you everything you need to know to get started with using manual mode. Hey guys, it's Liz and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'll be breaking down the exposure triangle using manual mode on this Nikon D3400. Now, the reason why I'm using this camera today is because it's a very basic camera. It's the most beginner camera that you can get of the Nikon series. And I thought it would be best to show you guys on something that's simple as opposed to something that's complex that has a lot more buttons. So no matter what camera you're using to follow along with today, essentially they all have the same settings and functions, they just navigate differently. So before I go through the camera settings with you guys, I thought I should explain what the exposure triangle actually is. Essentially, just imagine a triangle and on each side you've got the ISO, you've got the shutter speed, and you've got the aperture. All three of those elements, they need to be balanced in order to create a properly exposed photo. If you change one setting, you actually need to change the other two to make sure that the picture is still properly exposed. So now hopefully you understand the exposure triangle as clear as mud. Let's jump into the D3400 and I'll show you how to use these settings on the camera. Alrighty, so the first thing you want to do is turn your camera on. And then you want to switch it to manual mode. So manual mode is the M there. So I've already had it set there, but essentially you just turn your dial or whatever you need to do on your camera to get to manual mode, and that's what you do. So now let's go through the settings on the screen. So what you've got over here is the ISO. Now this controls the amount of light that actually comes in through the sensor of the camera. This changes depending on the time of day. So for example, if what you're shooting has very low light, what you want to do is up the exposure to increase the amount of light that comes in through the sensor, or vice versa. If you're in a setting which is very brightly lit, say the middle of the day, then you want to actually decrease your exposure to let in less light to maintain that balanced photo. The next one over here, the middle one, is known as your aperture or your f-stop, as you can probably see by the little F there. So sometimes that can be confusing. It took me a little bit to get my head around that f-stop and aperture were the exact same thing. Essentially, this controls the depth of field. So if you want a shallow depth of field, which is where you have the background blurry with the object that you're focusing on being sharp and in focus, then you want a lower f-stop number, or vice versa. If you want everything in your picture to be sharp, so for example, if you're doing landscape photography where you want the mountains, the foreground, and everything that you're focusing on to be sharp, then you're going to want a higher f-stop number. So your f-stop can also control the amount of light that comes into the camera, and I'll show you how. So if you look at this diagram in the middle here, you'll see as I change the f-stop, the little white circle in the middle either gets bigger or smaller. The larger the f-stop, the smaller the hole. That means that there's less light coming in through the end of the camera. However, if I was to lower the f-stop, it therefore increases the circle in the middle, therefore allowing more light to come in through the end of the camera. So that's also good to keep in mind for when you're photographing out in the field, because that can also help you with your light. If you're in really low light situations, you can actually open up your aperture to increase the amount of light that comes in. So that's kind of how you get your balance. So now moving on to the shutter speed. This one controls how quickly the shutter opens and closes in order to take the picture. So you'll see here, if I change the dial, how it goes to like 1/200th of a second, or if I keep changing it, it's actually going to go faster. So now it's going to be 1/2000th of a second, which is actually really fast. So that'd be good for like sports mode and stuff like that if you're doing action shots. But if you go to the other end of the scale, you start entering into seconds. So right here, you've now just entered 1 second, and then you've got 4 seconds, and it keeps going until you get to bulb mode. Bulb mode is good for when you have a remote and you want to do long exposure, like really long exposure, as in you want to leave it open for 30 seconds, 2 minutes, It's good for night photography. So I'll do another video on that in the future when I can actually go out somewhere and camp there for the night. But for now, yeah, that's also really good for like really long exposure where you can actually control how long the shutter is left open for. And then you guys also see time. I've actually looked this up. I don't think there's much difference between bulb and time, but if you have a more advanced camera, like an intermediate to advanced camera, you can actually plug in it into velometer, and that can control the time in which the shutter goes off. So if you want to take 6 pictures with an exposure of 30 seconds, every 30 seconds, the shutter will open and close until those 6 pictures are taken. So this little scale down here is actually really helpful. This will always help you get a perfectly exposed photo. It works most of the time. Sometimes in certain situations, it may not always read true. For example, if you're doing night photography or you're doing long exposure, it will actually say that the photo is going to be too dark when in actual fact it's not going to be, because if you have your shutter open for like 30 seconds, it's going to be letting in all that light. So sometimes it won't always read true, but if you're just doing standard photography at this point in time, it's actually really helpful. So now that I've explained each of the settings, I'm going to run through some examples of how you might use these when you're out in the field. But before we go changing any settings, the first thing you need to think about is what you want to shoot. You want to think about what composition you want. You want to think about what type of depth of field you want. Are you shooting an action shot or a sports shot? So you really need to think about these things because you need to figure out what your priority is. For example, if the object that you're trying to photograph is moving really quickly, then you want your shutter to be your main priority. Now, what I mean by that is that will be the starting point for your settings. So what you want to do is you want to set that to the right setting and then change the other settings to create that balance. So let's just say you're at your child's soccer game. You're trying to photograph your child running up and down the soccer field. Basically, this is where your shutter will be your priority. So you change that to a very fast shutter speed. So I'm never too sure what shutter speed to use, but you can never go wrong with 1/1000th of a second. I always find that's actually a really good shutter speed to use when you're trying to capture things really quickly. I used this when I went to the beach, and for me it worked really well. And I've used it in other occasions where I've needed the shutter speed really fast and it's never let me down. So, I mean, I would recommend that, but you can change it later if you need to let in more light. The second thing is your depth of field. Do you want to mainly focus on your child on the soccer field, or did you want to get everything else around him sharp as well? So for this one, I would recommend maybe having it in the middle. So anywhere between, I'd say, f8 to f18. That's kind of a happy middle. So if you have your f-stop anywhere between those 2 points, then you should have pretty much everything somewhat in focus. You might find that the edges of your photo are a little bit blurry, but at least your child who's in the photo, obviously the main subject of the photo, surrounded by other players and maybe the soccer ball, they will be in focus. So for that one, I'm going to put it on f11 to let in a bit more light, because let's take in consideration that we've just put it on a really fast shutter speed, which means it's going to open and close really quickly, meaning not much light is going to go in through the end of the lens. Now, for the ISO, some people might set their exposure first to obviously set up the lighting conditions for the time of day that they're shooting in. It doesn't really matter in my opinion, but because you can always kind of go back and forth and change it until you get that perfect balance between the 3 elements. So for me, let's say your child's soccer game is at 10 o'clock in the morning. So the sun's up, it's a nice bright day, it's not too cloudy out. So you probably want to set it on about 200. So let me just remember how I change it. On the Nikon, it actually gives you little examples. So that's showing it's a bright day, that one's showing it's inside, that one's showing for nighttime. So like I said, it's 10 o'clock in the morning, it's a nice bright day, so you want to put it on 200. So this means that it's not letting in as much light for the exposure. All right, so let's move on to another example. So if you were out shooting landscape photography, the settings would actually be quite similar, except you don't need your shutter speed to be as fast, unless it's obviously a bit of a windy day and you want to make sure that the leaves and the branches and the grass stay quite crisp. But even then, you don't need your shutter speed to be on 1/1000. Essentially, if it's early in the morning, it's a nice bright sunny day, you can keep your ISO on 200. When it comes to your f-stop, if you want the whole scenery to be be in focus, you want to maybe keep it on the highest f-stop that you can. So f22, or even a little bit lower if you just want to let in that bit more light. So anything, I reckon f16 upwards will keep everything nice and focused and still allow a bit of light through the end of the lens. Now for your shutter speed, this is where again it can help to let more light in, especially because you've got your f-stop on such a high number. That's where it gets a little bit tricky. That's why I honestly heavily rely on that little diagram, because I can click it and go, okay, that's letting in less light. Cool. So back to your shutter speed. Anywhere, I reckon, if you're doing handheld photography and say wind isn't really an issue, so the grass isn't blowing around everywhere, the trees are perfectly still, a setting like that is pretty good. So 200 for a nice bright day, f16 for everything to be in focus, and 100 if you're holding it with your hand, because it actually won't get any camera shake, because the shutter is actually nice and fast but not too slow that it will pick up if you accidentally move your hand for a split second. So just a little side note though, if you do have your shutter speed anywhere lower than, I reckon, 180 or even 160, anything lower than that, it will start to pick up a bit of camera shake if you are shooting with the camera in your hand. If you find that for lighting conditions you do need to have your shutter speed on a lower setting, I'd recommend putting it on a tripod so it won't get that camera shake. Or even better yet, because sometimes even having it on a tripod, even when you push the button, that enough can be enough to just move the camera a smidge bit. I find if you put it on a 3-second timer and then with the camera on the tripod, then push the button, it will then count down 3 seconds, then take the photo. So you're not even touching the camera when it's taking the photo, which is actually a really handy tip. I've used that when doing night photography or in like really low light situations. So back to the landscape photography. So if it's a little bit windy and you want to capture the branches and the leaves and the grass nice and crisp, anywhere, I reckon 1-200 would be good for that. But yeah, anywhere between 100 and 200 plus, you should be fine. But just again, make sure your scale is balanced to let you know if the photo will be properly exposed. So now we're going to move on to something a bit more complex. So this is kind of stepping outside the normal point and click and shoot. This is where you start to get a little bit creative with the photos that you take. Alright guys, I hope I haven't confused you all too much. If I forgot to explain something or you have a question, pop it in the comments below and I'll be sure to reply. Thanks for watching and I'll see you all next Wednesday. Bye! Hey guys, it's Liz. Today I will be baking. Today I'll be baking. Why are you sticking my feet? You can come up. Do you want to come on this side? Look, come on this side. Because you're kind of in the way. Come on. Thank you. Yes, go put your fur over here. Yes, kitty. No, you can't come on my lap.